Alrighty, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first series or first session of the 2022 Volunteer Engagement Series. We're very, very excited to have a special guest speaker. We have many guest speakers this year for the series, but I'm personally extremely excited to hear Corina Sadler, who I've heard many times on many national webinars, and I'm so thankful that she's here to kick off our session, our series this year, really. Talking about starting fresh. When I saw the title, I thought, how perfect. January, let's start fresh and start with an amazing speaker. So before we turn it over to Corina, I just want to thank you all again for supporting me in this ongoing training opportunity. We're going into year 2 doing this. We started it in 2020. So thank you all so much for your continued support. Hopefully we're able to continue this for many, many years to come and have great dynamic speakers, so you just don't have to listen to me ramble on and on all the time, because you all know how much I love to talk about volunteer engagement. So speaking of me, my name is Sydney Shuttro, and I'm the Director of Volunteer Engagement at the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disability. For anyone who's new to the webinar series, all of our previous sessions are on the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disability's YouTube channel, so you can go back and view those. If you want any of the materials that were discussed, I have all those things on file, and I'm happy to send that to you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Corina Sadler to talk to us about starting fresh with staff and volunteer relations. Let her introduce herself a little bit, and I'll also have some updates at the end of the webinar session as well. So Corina, welcome, and thank you so much again for being here with us today.
Awesome. Thank you, Sydney. I appreciate the invitation. I'm so excited to be here. I'm used to being on camera as well, so I did my hair and put on makeup, but just know that I'm looking fabulous this morning. Those of you who saw me on video, hopefully you saw me wave to you guys, but the PowerPoint will carry my words through. You can envision me with wild hand gestures and big smiles and eyes, really excited about this topic. And I am very comfortable with interruptions. I already told Sydney if there's something going on in the chat box. I am on double monitors, but I'm not really used to Teams. So all for breaking in and letting me know if there's a great question. It can be anonymous, of course, since this topic can be sensitive sometimes when we're talking about staff and volunteer relationships. So if something's on your mind, definitely feel free. You could reach out to Sydney, put it in the chat box, and she'll alert me. And then Sydney, also let me know, give me a time, maybe 5 minutes until you'd like me to stop so that you have time for your ending announcements as well. All right, so more about me. Again, I'm Corina. I'm a CVA, which is a Certified Volunteer Administrator like Sydney. I'm celebrating 10 years as a CVA this year. I supervise a large municipal, well, large to me, but it's a municipal volunteer program in Plano, Texas. So I'm right outside of Dallas-Fort Worth right now. And today is probably the coldest day we've had. I think we're in the 30s, which for Texans is crazy. So we're all bundled up here. But I've spent the last 16 years mainly in local government. I got started on this journey when I began volunteering at 12. Volunteering has had a huge impact in my life. I wouldn't be where I am if I hadn't taken the initiative to volunteer at a young age. Growing up in a Hispanic family in North Texas, both of my parents are Mexican. Their views on volunteerism were very informal, right? We help one another, we help our families, we don't register to volunteer. So I stumbled upon formal volunteerism, I think through reading, through school and friends. And one of those places, which I wanted to mention that I didn't include on the slide, but I think you guys will understand, I began volunteering at a senior center when I was 16. And that was really the jumping off point for my mentorship through professionals, and then my and their inspiration for me to go to college really was that senior recreation center. So I've always had a big love for seniors and older adults. I still call them seniors, older adults. And I watched Golden Girls growing up. I watched my grandmother through her long-term care journey before she passed away, volunteering at that senior center. I just loved seniors. And I really thought, wow, there are careers that do this, right? That engage seniors, that provide activities and support and advocacy. And it opened up a whole new world for me. So thank you for the work that you're doing for your organizations in the community. They make a huge impact. Many unsung heroes with us today, over 40 people, making it, going through this pandemic time in the positions that you work in is just really inspiring. And so I wanted to definitely thank you. I've received a couple of national awards. I also volunteer with some national associations that you'll see on the screen. Through my volunteerism, I also hear a lot from professionals in the field, right? When I'm not presenting, I'm coordinating volunteers. I supervise the volunteer program. So I am answering phone calls, emails from staff and from volunteers. So I am definitely still in this work every day. But through my other associations, I hear other perspectives from other organizations. Like I said, I'm in local government, but I do hear from the nonprofit sector, from the faith-based sector, from all kinds of professionals that are looking at this dynamic of, returning to the staff and volunteer relationships. I've also been in several podcasts. One of them I think is Senior Focus, the Volunteer Leader, or the Volunteer Force podcast, and then a couple of YouTube interviews. I also am a gerontology major in my undergraduate studies. I typically don't say that at national or large trainings because no one knows what that is, but I think you guys know what that is. So that senior volunteering transitioned me into becoming a gerontology major, and I'm really glad I did. I learned so much. All right, so in the chat box, how are you feeling about staff and volunteer relationships? Pick a number, drop it in. I should be able to see the responses. You can be honest. I like the 7s for sure. Gotta have some 5s. I usually have some 5s in the room. Got some thinkers. You guys are thinking about this one. You want to be honest, right? Okay, here come the 3s and some 2s. Awesome. All right, so when we're kind of figuring out where we fit between staff and volunteer relationships. Now I use the word staff, I use the word volunteer. Staff would be paid, obviously volunteers are unpaid, but depending in your setting, your audience, your stakeholders might be called other things, whether they're AmeriCorps members, or they're some kind of advisory team or auxiliary team, or it's a board, or whatever your constituency is. You can just replace those words that fit for you. Basically, we're just talking about people. And I know titles are very broad. So that's just kind of my view today would be unpaid and paid people working together in an organization. So when, in my experience in working with staff and volunteers, sometimes I have felt like the referee. I come in, I need to solve a dispute. I have a rule book, right? And I'm going to work through the rules and then referee the situation. And then I might go off, right? Go back to my office. Sometimes I feel like the judge, where I get called in, right? Something's happening between staff and volunteers, and they want me to make the decision, right? They're hands off. They're like, this is what's going on. Be judge. Tell us yes or no what to do. Make that decision. In other situations, I feel like the maintenance person, where I come in to, for me, it's different departments. For you, it could be different programs or locations or different scenarios where I come in, I kind of do some tweaking, right? I'm doing a little maintenance. I'm kind of making sure, okay, the trainings are being done this way. The staff is saying hello to volunteers. The volunteers are wearing the right uniform, whatever it is, right? Just kind of some maintenance of this inner workings. Other times I'm the cheerleader, right? I want to boost morale. I want to make them feel like they're a team. I want to reinforce the connection between the staff and volunteers, right? So it's not us versus them. And I read a lot about that when I read about volunteer engagement. I read case studies and other things, that us versus them feeling, right? That lives in volunteer programs, lives in organizations. And so it's something I'm constantly wanting to know more about, wanting to understand in organizations that are unlike mine. Why do we have that us versus them sometimes? But in the cheerleader, when I feel like that, I feel like, okay, I want to boost everybody up. I want to make them, they're all wearing the same t-shirts. We eat lunch in the same break room, like, that we are energized and ready as a team. And then other times I feel like I'm a tourist. So I pop in, right? I'm kind of, okay, I take great pictures of people together. I don't really hear from anyone of what's going on. Maybe I'm recruiting and placing volunteers, and then their supervisor is receiving them and orientating, and they go off right into the sunset. But I come by, I'm on tour, I'm like tourist, I'm looking, and I'm like, okay, well, I guess everything's good, right? No news is good news. I'm enjoying my time with this team, and I'm just gonna go off about my way. So sometimes when we enter a workplace or an experience with working with staff and volunteers, we have to choose, right, what persona we are, who we are in this situation, especially if it's undefined within our job descriptions, within our hierarchies, or the ability for us to make decisions. We have to make a choice of who we are. And it's never too late to change that, right? If I always feel like I'm coming in as the judge all the time, I'm coming in and just making decisions, and they're never calling me for these other things, or I'm never visiting this site for other reasons, well, I have the ability to change that. So when we come into volunteer programs, or say we've been there a long time, we've cultivated the culture, maybe everything is going really well, that's awesome. But sometimes we have new volunteer managers that start with volunteer programs that they did not create, and they're jumping in. So what creates that us versus them between staff and volunteers? Well, sometimes it can be the fears, right? Fears on both sides. Fears from what staff worry about related to volunteers. It could be stereotypes. Again, these are both sides, right? Volunteers have these things, staff have these things, but stereotypes about who volunteers are. We can have new staff members come in, which I've had, and they come in with these predetermined stereotypes about who and what volunteers are and do. And so sometimes I have to break those stereotypes. Now, this can be challenging, but when it creates an issue, when we're trying to start fresh, I need to understand, where is that coming from? There also can be just ongoing misunderstandings, right? Things that have happened over time that were not addressed. Maybe something was going on and then we closed, right? Everybody closed and things were not resolved. So when we start fresh, when we want to, restart or relook at some issues, finding out like what was unresolved, what are some misunderstandings, because those things can linger. And for certain types of people, it really bothers them over time, staff and volunteers. And there is a lot with prejudice, right? Prejudice lives everywhere. We have to address it. There's great trainings out there. I'm not an expert in that area, but it's something that needs to be looked at. If you feel that your volunteers are being treated unfairly, if their dynamic with staff is turning negative because you've introduced new volunteers or new staff, looking at this. So in 2018, I was a new supervisor for the volunteer program. I had been here, but I was promoted. So I kind of was a little worried about some of these things. And kind of that I was going to be losing my grip, right, on the program. And you have a lot of people moving in and out. Sometimes you worry you don't have a handle on what's happening, especially if there's issues related to staff and volunteer relationships. So I had to sort of get my focus, right? Where do I need to spend my time? You know, is it with staff? Is it with volunteers? Or is it with myself to get training, to make a plan, to address my hold on the situations that were happening with staff and volunteers? So sometimes from staff, you might hear some of these things. And if you've heard these before or you've had experience with some of these, and you can drop that number in the chat box if one of them resonates with you. But I hear from staff over the years that volunteers can be really disruptive, right? They interrupt the workday. And other volunteer managers have said that if their volunteers do really well, then staff look less effective, which I had never thought about. I definitely heard about the chatty volunteers, number 3, right? The volunteers that bring in their cup of coffee and stand next to the cubicle and want to check in. And I think we've learned through a lot of training about different personality types and work styles and your Enneagram, and that there are people that connect in that way. And this last one was another kind of rude awakening for me when I thought of all these great ideas, was that some of the projects I was pulling from staff were their favorite parts of their job, right? They didn't want to give them up. And I had never really thought about that, right? That I'm pushing to take over the, I don't know, poster making, envelope stuffing, sorting, things I thought, hey, these are great volunteer positions. But maybe the staff put on music and every Friday they do this ritual and they, I don't know, stuff the envelopes or sort XYZ, and that's their bonding time, and they don't want to give it up. So there is the myth that everyone knows how to work with volunteers, or that those in a workplace that have some training, that have worked in an environment with multiple types of people, that they can just transition that experience to working with volunteers. And that would be great. But from what I've seen and heard, if you take someone that has very little experience with volunteerism, has never been a volunteer, has never worked in an organization with a strong volunteer presence, putting the word volunteer makes them nervous. It makes them change and be different. Now, some people are flawless, right? You can trust them to lead volunteers, and they understand the program, how this is community engagement. But there's some others that need training, right? And how to lead volunteers, how to supervise them. Could be part customer service. It could be part, program management. I mean, there's so many different things, and where we have volunteers that are serving. but some people get uncomfortable. And I had to realize that not everyone understands and knows how to work with volunteers. Even if I tell them, they're just people, right? They're just people. Why are you so upset? The expectations are different, or they might view them as being different. These are, in my situation, local government. Our volunteers are voters. They are taxpayers. They're often neighbors. It's a little different when you view them in that way versus a coworker who applied for a job. So as volunteer managers, we are amazing advocates. And when I started my career, the word advocates and advocacy, I was confused by it. I thought it meant certain things, and other people, right, outside people that don't work in this sector might view that word differently. But in our positions, or for those that lead volunteers with whatever job title they have, we are constantly watching, right? Watching what is happening. We're listening to so many stakeholders. I think more than many other positions within our organizations, that we have to watch and listen for cues, for information, right? To find out changes, what's going on, how people are feeling, right? About working with volunteers, or how our volunteers are feeling about their placement with staff. Some things are unsaid. When we return more to in-person, we're watching, body language, we're listening to tone of voice. When a volunteer or a staff member calls, telling us something's going on. We're also learning constantly the dynamic, I think, of bringing people together, your paid and unpaid workforce. It's a constant thing that you're working on, right? You always want to make it better. You always want to be there, be a resource, be available. So to do that, we learn, right? That's why you're here, part of this great group, coming monthly to trainings. And that's the next one, that we train, right? To get a better understanding, to get perspective, and maybe to get tips. This room is a wealth of knowledge. You all have your own experiences, your unique perspectives. So coming together to train together, and hopefully network and do some other things throughout the year, is such a strong way to advocate, right? For your role and for one another. We also give feedback. We are the ones, at least for me, to fire a volunteer, right? Or to tell a staff member, hey, we're pulling events this weekend. I think we need to work on some issues that we've had last week from under your supervision, things like that, right? We have to give feedback. And that's part of advocating for staff and volunteers, is that when we receive feedback, we have to take action. We have to do something with it. And that's hard, especially if it's negative feedback, if it's concerning, if it's feedback that you had no part of, right? But you have to take action. And that looks a few different ways. I think I'll have some examples, but taking action for the volunteer manager is the only way to move things forward, to get some sleep at night, to not be nervous when a certain person's calling or emailing, saying, was anything done? I let you know something happened last weekend with so-and-so. I'm a volunteer. What are we going to do? because we do want the best for everyone. That's part of our role, is walking the line between wanting volunteers to engage and enjoy their service, wanting staff to be excited about the volunteer program, and keep creating opportunities. If those two things aren't happening together, it causes problems. And we may put on one of those hats to come in and try to fix it. Talking more about advocacy, we really, going into 2022, we want to bring the best parts back, right? The last 2 years have been very difficult. You might be new to your organization, you might have held on through that time and you've stayed, but we really want to look at those 2 years in relation to staff and volunteers and say, okay, what are the best things that happened, right? The best parts. Let's bring it back and let's let go, change some of the other things that did not work over that time. I think a lot of things were piloted, right? We've done so many different responses to the pandemic. Not all of them worked. Either there wasn't buy-in on one side or that need is no longer there. Whatever it is, you can still take your best from those experiences. You can also start creating some goals around those things as you look back and setting some goals. Looking at the relationships within your organization, between your stakeholders, staff and volunteers, and yourself, you can really take time to plan around those things and try to solve some of the problems. If everything went really well, those you really want to keep that for sure moving forward, the things that went really well, and maintain. So looking at advocacy for volunteers, right? They are out in the community, or you might have virtual volunteers, right? They're online, whatever your unpaid workforce is doing, they're advocating for your organization, right? They're doing the Facebook fundraisers, they're wearing your t-shirt out at, baseball practice for their kids. Some, if they've returned in person, might be bringing snacks for staff. So in the chat box, if you put, how do you think your volunteers are advocates? Might give somebody else a great idea, but either advocate for your organization as a whole, your cause, or for you as the leader of volunteers or the volunteer program. All right, I see in the chat box, bringing in new patients, right? Spreading the word, sharing your resource, finding people that would benefit, sharing testimonials, promoting the mission, right? Making those introductions. A lot of word of mouth I'm seeing, telling other people, sharing the news at other organizations that they're affiliated with, word of mouth volunteer recruitment, right? Bringing a friend. I think every time I say bring a friend, I don't know that any of our volunteers actually do, but maybe when we return to more programming, that'll happen. Donating money. Yeah, right? Some of our donors are also, some of our volunteers are also donors, funding programs. I see they voice challenges and successes of the organization. That outside perspective is definitely advocacy, right? To make sure the organization stays on the right track. You're viewing your constituents and hearing from them. Thank you all for participating. That's awesome. And then looking at how they advocate for you. Most of us are paid staff members of our organizations. We might have some volunteer leaders who are volunteers. But then how do we reciprocate that? Right? How do we then advocate for volunteers outside of maybe our job description or our day-to-day, right? Just running excellent programs or getting things done. You know, if there's, we've had it at one facility, you know, a pathway to an entrance that volunteers use that gets muddy when it rains and no one's complaining. It's like, man, you know, it's mud. Like, can we not put some paving stones there so our volunteers don't have to walk through the mud on the rainy days that we have? We also had some super old aprons, right, that volunteers wore on duty. Can we not, you know, replace those and get some new ones? Nobody's complaining. Staff is really busy. But for the volunteer manager to look at how they can advocate for volunteers in small ways can help some of that relationship. Also looking at when there are disputes between staff and volunteers, is the employee always presumed to be right? Does the employee have more opportunity to give feedback, to express what happened? Some new volunteer managers that I work with, I also teach a certificate program for volunteer management, which typically is new volunteers, and they haven't had this yet, right? They have not really had a dispute. So being prepared for when it happens, because typically there will be something going on, right? That you'll need to get involved in. I see a comment about volunteers being advocates by being the voice of reason. I like that. I also like that phrase, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I've heard that quite a few times. Very, very true. And then looking at how the exit of volunteers is handled. Do we have volunteers that leave because they feel that they're not accepted? And how do we keep them visible? They feel invisible, or we feel that our massive volunteer workforce is invisible in these relationships within our organization. We might have 10 volunteers, we might have 5,000. For me, the size is not the issue, right? We are one person, we can only do so much. So looking at just those relationships that we have a touch point with, that we are responsible for or are concerned about. So looking at advocacy for staff. So in my certificate program, when I work with new volunteer managers, they are very volunteer focused, right? That is their job. They were hired to lead volunteers, to restructure a program. They're very much hyper focused on volunteers, which is, it's obviously they feel that's their point. So they don't think about advocating for staff. And it's something I feel like you learn along the way, right? As you realize in your role that you need buy-in for your job, for your program. You need information from people. You need an ear sometimes. You need items. I mean, there's so many things that staff bring, even to a department, especially to a department of one, which we have many, right? Volunteer departments of one. That relationship you might determine when you're starting fresh, that you really want to look at where you're spending your time. It might be with staff. It might be that we want to build advocates for the volunteer program from our staff. And one of the ways that I see that being effective is when volunteerism is brought up at the organizational level and we are not in the room, who speaks? Are there others that would say, oh, you're talking about volunteers. You need to talk to Corina. Or actually, we have a volunteer program. I think you should call Sydney and invite her to this meeting next time. When we are not in the room, our staff can turn into advocates for the volunteer program, for volunteers, and for our role. So how do staff advocate? Staff that are not leaders of volunteers in your organization, how do they advocate for your program? Put that in the chat box if you have examples or things that you've seen or heard now or in the past. I think sometimes those can be overlooked, right? We love our supporters. I was in a Zoom with a lot of volunteer engagement pros, and the question was, who are your biggest fans at work? Which staff members are your biggest fans? And everyone had a pretty difficult time talking about it, right? They weren't really sure. And I feel that it can be hard to build in staff and building advocacy with them into the many, many hats that you're wearing and what you're doing. But if you're looking at staff and volunteer relationships and you're having pain points, looking at advocacy for staff might be worth some time. So how do you advocate for staff? Recognizing that, looking to see what you bring. Obviously, you are providing the great resource of a volunteer program. You are marketing for them, correct? In most positions, we are recruiting and screening and interviewing and placing volunteers externally with other staff outside of ourselves. So looking at that and recognizing that as being as part of advocacy, right, that we do for our staff members. I see that staff are including volunteer opportunities when they're doing outreach. Awesome, right? If you make a great volunteer flyer and staff are willing to stick it in their, newcomer bag, their outreach tote, that you can get your volunteer program information further out if you're recruiting. If staff can help you do that, that's awesome. I see that staff are going out into the community for doing for education and outreach. Yeah, great point about the pandemic really putting a spotlight on volunteers as a vital part of programs, right? Of the success of initiatives when we don't have volunteers and staff are coming in, the workload. It can be a very heavy load. I see another one about staff giving referrals for volunteers. That's awesome. To move them up. We look at sometimes our staff job descriptions when we have a point of frustration. We might say, it's in their job description to lead volunteers. They know they're supposed to do this. Why am I having an issue with this staff member working with volunteers? We have to look at how is it embedded into their position? Have they received the training? Do they see you as a colleague, as a resource, as someone that they can work with, right, to enhance their work by applying volunteer support? A lot of times we might have staff with, again, that negative feeling of volunteerism that see it as additional work, right? That supervising volunteers or preparing for volunteers is additional to their primary work instead of it being a part of their work. And that does feel different, right? If I feel like I'm adding something to my plate versus I knew from the get-go that this is part of my plate. I do all of this together. When you have staff that refuse to work with volunteers, right? How the organization handles that scenario says a lot about how they view the structure of the volunteer program, if staff are allowed to say no, right? And or to do things to sabotage, unfortunately, the volunteer initiative that they're over because they see that as additional work. So that positive reinforcement we're going to talk about to build up this advocacy within your staff teams. I've also heard when being hired that staff have no clue that volunteerism is a priority or that they will be expected to engage volunteers. And so that can be difficult, right? To kind of wrap their head around, especially if they're coming in with those negative feelings about volunteers. And I never want to forget you in your role, whatever your title is, or however you view yourself in the context of volunteer engagement. How do you advocate for your role? What are things that you do, either formally or informally? Put it in the chat box to advocate for your position. Or if you've left a previous volunteer engagement position and now you're doing something a little different, do you see advocating for that role differently now that you've left it? Or if you're a supervisor and you have staff under you that lead volunteers, what does that advocacy for their role look like? All right, the responses are coming in. I see several things about showing impact. That is awesome. Alive has an annual hybrid virtual conference so this fall in October. I think their theme is going to be about showing impact, right? How to report more than just the numbers. So that's going to be really exciting for our sector because this comes up a lot, like it just did, right? Showing the impact of our work, right? Of our role and how to use that to advocate for what you do in your work. Sharing the data, sharing outcomes, bringing up volunteers in meetings. I love that. Yeah, right? Volunteers should be on the agenda at the appropriate times. They need to be listed. Showing the in-kind contributions of volunteers. Continuously educating upper management. I love that, right? Again, not everyone understands how to work with volunteers. Not everyone understands the way that our role as a leader of volunteers interacts with the relationships of staff and volunteers. A lot of assumptions, right? That they don't need a lot of maintenance, that relationship management piece is missing from our job descriptions, our goals, our annual review highlights, right? But I think the relationship management piece is so important. Being willing to share and offer constructive criticism, right? We have expertise. We have knowledge. Doing this work gives us a great perspective. And to be able to push that out and give that to others definitely advocates for our experience, right? Being brought in to projects, even that may not be ready for volunteers, but let us flex this knowledge that we have and let us contribute, right? offering that constructive criticism, sure. It could be ideas, it could be brainstorming, but having, advocating for what you bring. The last comment there about that we do such a great job creating this machine of the volunteer program that magically, if we leave, it will just run on its own with no oversight, no needed maintenance. Yeah, that's a common misconception for sure. Again, these are people. And I don't think you would say that about any other type of program in an organization, that it could run on its own without a supervisor or a manager. Great point. I'm not using names for the sake of the recording. I know not everyone wants their names out there. So talking about turnover trouble. In organizations, they could be large or small, but when we have a rotating door, it's hard, right, to maintain our momentum and enthusiasm for what's happening. Over the last 2 years, some of us may have been, right, furloughed. That was a word I don't think we had used very much in the workplace. Unpaid administrative leave. There are a lot of situations where staff were displaced. And so it can be really challenging when you have a cycle of staff and volunteers that are moving in and out constantly to maintain, right, to make the plan for how to proceed. But we have the chance, which is always exciting when you have new staff, to start fresh, right, to start over. A few different tactics that I've tried over the years with kind of this turnover. Getting a spot at new employee orientation, whatever that looks like. For me, it was at that point in person. New employees all met at the same place at the same time with HR. And so I was like, let me get in there. Give me literally 3 to 4 minutes. I won't take up much time. Let me talk about volunteerism. Is it important to our organization or not? Right? Is it integrated into what we do? Is it in our strategic plan? Is it a strategy to move our mission forward? If there's yeses there, then we need to inform our new employees of the state of volunteerism, where they're going to be seeing volunteers. I made a small flyer that I had printed that talked about the volunteer program as a resource for staff. So during the orientation, I talked about where they will be seeing volunteers and why, right? Why volunteers? And then in their handout, I spoke more to that my department is a resource for them as an employee, right? To support their initiatives. If they want to get engaged in their new community, if they have family and friends, boom, like we are here for you. So there was kind of a twofold message that I delivered very quickly, but it had a great impact. It was very well received. Some other things is trying to keep when new employee orientations were paused, or I think I lost one of my spots or whatever it was. Keeping the ear out for new staff. How am I notified? How, like, having some kind of process for knowing if there will be new staff in areas that are going to be engaging volunteers. I need to meet with them. I need to have a phone call right now. Maybe it's a Zoom, and say, I have the ability to share this information. So I need to start building that advocate and that staff member who's brand new. I also created a volunteer program orientation in a box, where I put everything that a new employee would need to know about volunteerism, and I made little bundles of it. And so I had it ready to go. So if I knew I was heading somewhere, I could grab it and take it with me for that new employee. And I knew everything was already created. And that's a great thing a volunteer could do as well. We created a smaller manual. So we have a supervisor handbook, which is for staff, right? It outlines kind of a general overview of everything they need to know about the volunteer program for the city and their role, right? As a supervisor or a leader who is not in the volunteer program. So I made it smaller, easier to understand, and I had printed copies available. So if you have other tips for how you handle turnover within your organization as far as staff, it could also be volunteers. I mainly focus on staff. I think the turnover for volunteers is constant. I'm happy to share the supervisor handbook. I will send Sydney the link. Let me write that down. And so yeah, if you have other tips for this issue where you're constantly bringing in new staff, if you're a small team and you don't have turnover, it might be that the volunteer turnover is what affects you. So you can look at it with that lens as well. How do you prepare for the constant new volunteers? And it might be certain key positions, right? Your leadership positions, and for volunteers, your presidents, your association leads, like whatever the term is. But it might be that you needed to create some kind of plan, right, to deal with this turnover. And you can pilot these things. I'm sharing lots of different things that I've tried, some different methods I feel like were well received by staff. But they know, things change. Now we have Zoom and we have some staff working from home. And so you can pilot, right? Pilot what you think might make an impact, depending on where those pain points are that you're having with volunteers, and how can you restart, right? Make that plan of action, set some goals to move forward. Having volunteers be a voice. If you have longer training opportunities, I see this comment in the chat, which is a great recommendation. Having volunteers come in, right? Give their input and stories, where it's just not all coming from the same voice. I love that. So in my advocacy relationship with staff, I work on internal marketing, right? Remaining highly visible for me as a leader of volunteers is something that I think really rolls into how the volunteers relate with me, how staff relate with me, and then how I work with them as the relationship management of all three of us together. What I've found through this internal marketing initiatives that I've been working on is that the way that we talk about our work is important. Even if it's in the hallway before a Zoom meeting starts, the way that we refer to the volunteer program, the volunteers, and to ourselves and our projects, people remember, people will, let's see, they'll repeat it. That's what I'm trying to say. They'll repeat the terminology that we use if we are excited or positive or negative about what we're saying. It's important. So building that trust, it takes time, right? We want to increase our value. We want to create better relationships. We want to gain that respect, right, for our position, for the constant work that we are doing. And sometimes it is another level. There is a level between our position and leadership, sometimes referred to as middle managers, right? They can sometimes be an obstacle. The trickle up, trickle down, information chain, whatever you call it, sometimes there can be a stopping point with that middle manager level that is not pushing our needs up or is not relaying support from the top down. So understanding where the obstacles are can also help you decide some of that focus, some of your goals. If the middle managers are not supporting training for staff and working with volunteers, if you are not being included in certain things, if you feel like your visibility is low, then some of that internal marketing, working with the stakeholders, figuring out where is this stop, this obstacle, and who is it, and what can I do to work on this relationship. Checking out the chat box. Annual performance reviews. Definitely think, yeah, senior management should give consideration for those employees who manage and recruit volunteers. Definitely agree. We had that question. We had, I think, a compensation study at my organization. So I sent information out like, don't forget, if you lead volunteers, to mention that, please. Nothing to do with your job title. It might not be in your job description, but this is the time. So to add, that's another form of like advocating, raising their profile for them leading their volunteers. I definitely agree. So check out the comments in the chat box. So remaining highly visible, creating this better relationship with your staff or with your volunteers, some other things that I've tried. Again, trying to not have the us versus them mentality, right? Creating that division between staff and volunteers. Where am I doing it? Because I feel like I can't always put the blame on others. I need to evaluate what I'm doing and am I making it look like a division between them? Right. My goal would be to bring them together, where that team mentality, right? That we are going towards the same mission. And so doing some of these things really created a turnaround, getting some of that buy-in from both sides, and trying not to be hyper volunteer focused, trying to have as much of an equal view of staff as valuable stakeholders as our volunteers, which could be controversial, I don't know, but in my setting, it really helped build that staff and volunteer relationships. So I looked at what am I putting out, right? I looked at my newsletter and looking at, do I talk about staff giving back, staff as volunteers, staff when they do volunteer projects together, right? Employee volunteerism. Or am I only talking about volunteers? Do staff not see themselves reflected in my newsletter? So I changed that. I started that listening and watching for content about staff volunteerism, and it was out there, right? Where they serve, someone's an after-school mentor, one of our departments went to the food bank, things like that, where I can tie in the world of volunteerism to our staff. I looked at our printed brochures, our marketing right now. I haven't given those out very recently, but it's online. Are there photos of staff and volunteers together? Right? They work side by side all day long. Am I excluding them from my materials? Do they see togetherness? My annual report as well. Am I mentioning the contributions of staff? We have a large-ish holiday giving program that my office coordinates, like Adopt an Angel style, that is exclusively for staff. We do a coat drive that's just for staff to give. Am I talking about that? Right? That's something that my office does. Why was I not talking about it? Is it because I was creating this spotlight on just volunteers? Did that create a tougher relationship in some of our areas? And then, of course, on the website, again, the way that you're writing and talking about volunteerism, is staff mentioned? Are there photos? If you have very few paid staff, this might be something else. This might be the board. This might be your fundraising volunteer crew. This could be an auxiliary team. your AmeriCorps members. It could be anybody that you feel you need to bring them together. And so finding information, putting the blasts out of looking at time. Send in your photos, send in this and that. It rarely gets a response, at least from me. People are super busy. So I have to go where they are, meet them where they are, find the information, go to them, use that watching and the listening and decide my goal, right? My goal was to create a newsletter that felt more together with staff and volunteers. They saw each other, they read about one another, and they saw that they are under one team. So spotlighting, I'm going to move through this just for the sake of time, but this quote by Dale Carnegie, remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. This is true. The feedback that I receive when I spotlight a staff member or a volunteer, when I ask to highlight or to get information, well received. People are excited, right? They did all this project together as their team. And who else knows about it? That internal marketing that then goes external. Well, very well received. So I mentioned listening a couple of times. About listening, just checking out the chat box. And I found is another way, right, to engage with new stakeholders or people that I have had a challenge with as far as relating them to the volunteer program or what I do, is to go into situations with these stakeholders and spend my time listening to what's going on with them and their priorities. And I don't bring up volunteers. If time allows and I'm able to do that, I will take advantage to listen, to get information, to try to have a window into that world of this staff member or this volunteer team or whatever it is. And I don't bring up volunteerism. I don't make a push for, I'll fix that with volunteers, or I'll get another staff member to bring that over or something like that. Like I try to just listen. And over time, I think it's reduced the anxiety of people saying, oh, the volunteer lady's here. Like she's going to want me to use more volunteers, or she's going to, whatever the assumptions are. I can come in, and then that also allows me to give feedback. Maybe not about volunteers, just the other knowledge, the other huge amounts of knowledge that we have, right? About our organization, about program management, events, data, running, a database, like anything, right? So that time when I can listen and not talk about volunteers has actually been a positive way for me to connect with other staff who think that volunteer management is very foreign and they just don't understand it. I can advocate and try to get them to understand it, but at certain times I need to spend my time listening. So showing up when you need them and showing up when you don't need them. Being there, being present. Another way, I'm trying to keep an eye on time. I love this in the chat box. Volunteering brings together a diverse range of people from all walks of life. It has helped this person to gain perspective on life, as there's no better way to understand it and the values of helping people in need. Definitely, right? Spending time, I think you'd use this there, spending time listening to your volunteers. If they're reflecting, if they're sharing with you about their experiences, that can build some of that as well. If you're not asking them to do more, if you're just listening to all that they've already given. Showing authentic appreciation. We have a Supervisor of the Year award. So this is for a paid staff member that goes above and beyond leading volunteers. This is something that my department, my volunteer program decides on and gives. Typically, it's not a CVA or a volunteer engagement professional. We did have one who is very deserving, but typically it is a staff member that is not in a volunteer program. So if they get a physical award, we get do a presentation, they get featured in our newsletter, in our annual report. And it's very well received. It's very uplifting. It is recognizing people that are not volunteer engagement professionals for going above and beyond. Because volunteer awards have been, the staple of time. We always show our appreciation typically to volunteers through some type of awards or recognition events. But for the staff, I felt, man, they're sitting here during this award and I just kind of felt bad. Like maybe they can share in the food, yeah, but I'm not really putting a spotlight on anyone and thanking them for really going above and beyond and helping me and teaching me a lot about the relationships that they have with their volunteers. But sometimes it is that tangible recognition for working with volunteers that adds importance, right? That says we care about this. We care about staff and volunteers working together. Another myth: volunteers know what channels to use to communicate with staff. Sometimes we have issues, right, with I don't know, maybe staff or volunteers texting staff members, volunteers sending emails off hours that they expect will be responded to on a weekend at 6 a.m. We might have volunteers that leave messages on dry erase boards, on sticky notes that fall off onto the ground and nobody saw it. So sometimes we, if we're looking at this relationship that we want to, kind of restart and refresh, it might be those channels of communication that need some training. We might need to put some goals around enhancing how information makes it from, it could be the volunteer to a staff member, or it could be the volunteer to you, a staff member to you, we fill it in. But that's usually another area that can create that tension between staff and volunteers of, I don't have an organizational email. I'm only here once a week as a volunteer. I really want some feedback. I really need to tell you something. How do I do it? So that collaboration piece, right, is critical when you want to progress. Thank you for joining us. So when you have more frequent communication, the volunteer will feel supported, right, and valued. I think during the pandemic, we communicated a lot. I think there was an increase in weekly emails or newsletters or Facebook posts. And so it's looking back and saying, okay, maybe we are at a different place now. What does that communication level need to be? Right? Did that not even over communicating, but did the increase in communication help us? Did it build some relationships? Did it increase our participation in our Zoom happy hour or breakfast on, Teams day? But including, looking at the information that you have and deciding, is that something we want to keep? All right, so this is a chart. I can't remember which book that I got this from, but it made a lot of sense to me. Thinking about communication, looking at maybe the last 2 years. You could do this for staff or for volunteers. I think I put this twice. No, I have a different one next. So something like this, where you are, let's say you're using it for your volunteers. You're looking at your different forms of communication over the last 2 years. And you might decide, okay, what worked, right? What was really good? Maybe it was you started texting people, right? That was really good. Maybe you went back to old school phone calls, right? You did some wellness checks on your volunteers. You did some calling tree or whatever. Maybe that worked really well. But maybe you haven't done that in 4 months, right? But you don't want to forget. You don't want to forget the positive things that you did along communications that worked. The second column, maybe you tried some things that didn't work. Maybe you need to write down why, right? You made hard copies, you went door to door, you didn't get a good ROI on that. Or you've restarted some in person and the attendance is low. Or your email open rate, right? Not great. So understanding what isn't working, either in your communications for staff or volunteers, is a good use of your time so that you can then set some goals and use your time even more effectively. But what would some of these things be good for? So maybe you haven't, right? You don't text, you don't have an app. But if you did, what would it be really good for communication? So some people that are more visual, I know there's some list makers in the room, people that love, right, charts and things. So this is an example for that group of some ways you can break down some of this communication if that's an area in your relationships with staff and volunteers that you feel is a goal, that you want to work on that communication now, using the last 2 years of your trials. This is another one for my list makers. So when I think of issues with staff and volunteers, I might do something like this with a staff member. If I'm going into a meeting and let's say, animal shelter orientation, I send 12 volunteers and my staff member is having a problem. So I'm looking at the time frame, working through that with them. Do you need 12 volunteers on the 3rd week of the month for this new orientation? Am I wrong? Let's talk about this time frame. Does this work? Where's the pain point in the process? And then I might say, okay, when we have the date, right? On that week leading up to orientation, what does there need to be less of? Right? Maybe I can encourage my staff member not to, I don't know, do anything flexible, right? That could be maybe lesson during that week, or maybe it's me. I make a note. I'm not going to be sending them new volunteer interviews during that 3 days leading up to the orientation or something. But what do we need to increase? Okay, maybe there needs to be signs posted. Maybe reminders need to be sent multiple times. Then I'm looking at the stressors. Maybe for this staff member, other staff doesn't understand. They are preparing for a 20-person orientation, either over Zoom or in person. Maybe they keep getting interrupted during their preparation time. Maybe that's something I can help them with. Other stressors, an example, like volunteers showing up to the wrong place, right? So they come in late constantly. All right, well, let's look at this and see what we can resolve together. And then making sure that we build in some thank yous, follow-ups, what needs to happen, a kind of a post-event or post-activity timeframe so that we have that written down. So I might work through something like this with a staff member to get a better picture where I'm not placing blame on them that this isn't working, or, oh, you shouldn't be frustrated. You should be happy. I'm sending you 20 volunteers. Isn't that what I'm supposed to do? Instead, I can just take them through a discussion and apply my expertise where I can, and then advocate for them to get this improved and to get them better. And then I could also do this with volunteers as well. If there is an issue, trying to get through the details. And sometimes for those of us that have less experience in facilitation or in mediating, pulling information from someone makes us have, anxiety, bringing up sensitive topics, but there's lots of different workflows. So it's good to find out maybe what your style would be if you're having that staff volunteer relationship issue, or you just want to have some goals and get information from people. Okay, we're getting close to time. So, okay, some other tips. Maybe putting in more regular check-ins with whoever your stakeholders are that you're working with, that you want to start fresh, right? Get off to the right start for the year. Drip emails are something that it's automated in an email system, like maybe 3 weeks after a new volunteer starts, they get some kind of email. It could have a survey maybe, and maybe those survey results get shared with staff. Something like that, where you build in some processes to begin sharing information, bringing everybody together. Increasing your follow-up. And the same for staff and volunteers. Things happen, they think no one's looking, or what they're doing is unimportant. Right? Nobody's asking about it until a year later, 6 months later, when we're running a report or we're getting we notice we've lost all of our volunteers somewhere. Building some of those steps in. So again, when you're thinking of starting fresh, thinking of, it could be some goals, right? I love this from Gavin Hammer. Goal setting can be really challenging, but just breaking down what you'd like to do, what you'd like to see around staff and volunteer relationships. And then every week, choosing something to prioritize, protecting that time on your calendar, which I love. He said every day, but he's not a volunteer engagement professional, so it's every week. Put this away if you want to start, right? For volunteers, thinking of 2 things around relationships with the organization or with you or with staff. 2 things you could focus on that you've seen. Same for staff. Maybe there's 2 areas for the year that you want to focus on, you want to get refreshed. Their relationship with volunteers, or their relationship with you, or them in the community. It could really, just depending on your structure. And then for yourself, are there things, attending this training, I'm so glad you're here. I really appreciate this invitation to come and chat and share my experiences. But it's never too late. Setting goals, if you're not a goals person, I definitely understand, but just taking some time to plan and look at your successes, your things that you want to work on over the next year based on your 2 years that you've had. It's worth it. I think investing in you and how you relate to these relationships will make you stronger, more comfortable, looking at mediation training, conflict resolution. I mean, however you view these working relationships, it's valuable. I think it has, it's worth the effort. And so when I talk about the career of a volunteer engagement professional, we show up constantly. We are there, right? We are dedicated. We are steadfast in our knowledge. We want the best for everybody. As I mentioned at the beginning, all of our stakeholders. We need to be sure we're tracking their value that we're giving, right? That we are executing. Like I said, this room is a wealth of knowledge. You all have so much experience. So to give that value out, to be seen as a valuable resources in your organization is what I hope for. They will come to you, right, for information, for feedback, because we do so many things. I've seen from the chat box what everyone has put in, so many examples, real life scenarios and situations, your perspective. That's how you give value, right? You're giving back through your expertise in what you do. But being ourselves, being who we want to be in the workplace, and being realistic. I think when you're bringing staff and volunteers together and you want to start fresh, you want to create a team, it takes a lot of effort. It can be scary, but hopefully I've given you some tips today to get your mind thinking for the year. And I didn't mention resolutions. That's really hard, you know, in January, but I think these are long-term things. And I'm so glad that you're here. I'm on LinkedIn, so please connect with me. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. I share volunteer management resources, and I love coming out and doing presentations across the country. It gives, you know, I always learn something from the chat box or from those that unmute and have a question. So if you do have a question, a scenario that you're working through at your organization, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, thank you so much, Sydney, for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Corina. I don't know about everybody else on the call today, but I am inspired, I'm motivated, I have notes, I have goals. So just a couple things that you mentioned that I think we can all definitely relate to. Just giving everybody a chance to write down your social media links there. Definitely what you mentioned about the job descriptions. I think that's going to be one of my goals, is to work with our upper management. And for many of us, our job titles are program coordinators or senior center directors, or, you know, it doesn't have that volunteer word in our title. And therefore we don't have interaction with volunteers as part of our job roles, or even like a little line item. So I think that's something I'm definitely going to advocate more for throughout our agencies and in our network. If you wouldn't mind, could you send me some information on that certificate program that you do for new volunteer coordinators? Maybe some of us, even if we've been with the career field for a little while, we might all want a refresher or see what kind of new things you have to offer. If you wouldn't mind sending me that information. Wonderful. And this isn't the last time we're going to hear from Corina, so I'm excited. She's going to come back and join us in June. And you touched a little bit on this in your presentation, your professional brand. So you're going to give us a bit more of a deeper dive into that coming up in June. So cliffhanger, come back. So please feel free to add any questions into the chat box. I'm going to share my screen for a little bit and give you just a few updates. So while your questions are coming in, I can give you just a couple little tidbits of information I wanted to share. Nope, wrong way. Go figure. Swap screens. There we go. All righty. So here's just a few updates in terms of Tennessee updates, and I'm interested also in, Corina, some of your feedback on some of these things as well. So very excited to let you guys know that the 2021 Volunteer Impact Report for the state has been released. We released that back in the fall. I know it took much longer than anticipated. We're going to correct that. It's not going to take that long this year, promise. The report includes the following programs. I won't read all those to you. It doesn't include every volunteer program that we have. We had a couple programs opt out of the report last year, likely because of COVID and staff turnovers and, you know, just general craziness going on. So I'll include this. It's on our website, but I'll also include this in the follow-up email in case you all haven't seen it. It's a great report. We are in the process of working on our 2022 Volunteer Impact Report. That's going to include more programs and possibly some special projects that are out there. So keep that in mind if you have anything you wanted to add to that report. Our goal, so National Volunteer Appreciation Week, we always like to plug this early, April 17th to the 23rd. Start planning now in case you or your organization wants to do something for your volunteers that week. Not mandatory, but it is a good kind of recruitment tool, good reminder, a good way to promote the impact and just recognize your volunteers that week. We want to have our report for 2022 finalized by April 18th. So this isn't the formal request, but this is just kind of a heads up of what's coming. I will be reaching out to all of the programs to get some data reported back. And this is for the calendar year. So we're looking at January 1st, 2021 to December 31st, 2021. And I'm going to ask for that data to be due to me, or you send in your numbers by March 18th. So that gives everybody at least a couple months. I know some of our programs, I'm thinking of SHIP in particular, we ask our volunteers to send in and submit their data a month after the previous month. So December's data wouldn't be due until January. So it doesn't make sense for me to request data now when we know more data is coming in. And like I mentioned, we're going to release the 2022 Volunteer Impact Report on April 18th. So I think we actually released it in October of last year. So I'm getting a much better timeline. The work that we've done in the previous report, we had over 7,350 volunteers reported with over 260,000 hours of volunteer service. So the report's amazing. We're getting it printed to send to our elected officials for the legislative session that just started through our legislative liaisons. So we're really trying to get not only the volunteer impact out there, but we also have a lot of program data in the report, like how many meals were served, how many people were served, how many activities were done at the senior center, calls made, kind of anything that's rides given for senior volunteer transportation. So whatever the service is that program provides, we also have that program data that you can use to promote yourself in the community, presentations, things like that. So there is going to be more information to come. Like I said, this isn't my formal ask by any means, but I just wanted to give you a heads up that you'll probably be hearing a lot from me via email about some data that I'm going to request coming up here shortly. We also have a couple upcoming conferences I wanted to make you all aware of. Volunteer Tennessee has their Tennessee Conference on Volunteerism and Service Learning coming up in a couple weeks. Actually, Keita Cole and I, we're going to be doing a couple sessions. So if you want to listen to us talk some more, it's going to be February 13th to the 14th. We can hang out on Valentine's Day together. It'll be in person in Franklin, which is in Middle Tennessee, or you can also attend virtually. That's an option. The registration fee is $150. And if you want to look at the agenda so you can kind of see the sessions and everything that's going to be available, I have the link there for you. And I'll include this presentation in the follow-up so you can see any additional details. The next one is Points of Light. They're a national organization, probably, Corina, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the lead organizations in the world, I would argue. In volunteer management, they have their annual conference coming up in July, the 13th to the 15th. They're also doing it in person with a virtual option if you can't go in person. And they're having it at Disney. So I'm very tempted to put in a proposal and get down to Disney to attend the conference, not to go to Disney. Throwing that out there. Not a whole lot of specifics just yet. Registration opens on April 1st. So as I get updates, I'll be sure to let you all know the updates. And there's the link as well for more information. Corina also mentioned the Alive conference. I think you mentioned that happens in the fall. Once we get more information, I'll be sure to let everybody know about that as well. And just a friendly reminder, our next webinar will be Thursday, February 17th, same time. Hopefully same place for you guys. And we'll have another guest speaker, Susan Sanau, who's also a CVA. She's over in Fairfax. She'll be talking about working with volunteers of every generation. Corina mentioned she's a CVA. I am also a CVA, Certified Volunteer Administrator. They have an opening for sitting for the exam April 1st to the 15th. We started a study group for the CVA a couple years ago. We've had quite a few of us get our CVA certification. So if anyone's interested in joining that study group, we'll get that started up again. And it's really just kind of a weekly talk about volunteers. So even if you're not going to sit on the exam and you want to talk weekly about volunteers, please let me know. I'll get you that information. And then there's my contact information. Please reach out to me anytime. And I'm going to look and see if anything came into the chat box for you. Corina? I think there's a lot of thank yous and a lot of amazing presentations. Yeah. I will stop sharing my screen. Oh, maybe. There we go. All right, anyone, you can feel free to put your questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. If anyone has any final questions, we are at time, so I want to respect everyone's time, but I'll hang out for a few more minutes. Corina, I'll respect your time. If you need to head out, I understand. But if you can hang out for maybe a few more minutes, that would be greatly appreciated as well. Thank you all so much for attending the webinar, and we look forward to talking to you next month.